Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We have our second to last panel this week, and then next week will be our very last panel. So it's gone fast, at least for us, and we hope it's gone fast for you as well. So this week's theme, again, as you all have been doing, thinking of intersections between all of the talks, common themes, noting your questions, even if we can't get to all the questions at the end, save them for that discussion section because it makes for a great discussion. And feel free to reference talks, in the prior weeks that, may also sort of come up, over the course of these discussions and lectures. So so this week the name of our panel is What It Means to Be Human, and we will start right away with Dr. LaFleur.
Okay, good morning. So here is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm just going to introduce myself to you a little bit more in one slide. And then I'm going to talk to you about ethology, what that means and how it relates to what I do. And then I'll relate these to a couple of articles that I sent to you. One was, will AI help us talk to animals? And the other was about AI and the behaviors of wild animals. And then I'm going to finish off by talking a little bit about Neuralink and mind pong in monkeys, and also a little bit about the ethics of this type of research. Okay, I just want to take note of the time. Great. So about me, this is not me, but these are the animals that I study. So I am an anthropologist. That means anthro means human, and ology means study of. So I study humans, except I don't, because anthropology also includes the study of our closest living relatives, which are the non-human primates. So these are lemurs and their relatives, monkeys and apes. And so I specialize, as an anthropologist, I specialize in the study of primates, and lemurs are the species that I am, or the group of animals that I'm most interested in. And this picture here I just took a few weeks ago in Madagascar, and these are ring-tailed lemurs. What they're doing here is that they are going to bed. They sleep in these little holes in fissures of caves and in limestone. But bed is very political for lemurs, so they have to do this in a very specific way. Dominant females have priority of access, so they can come in first or they can come in last. But everybody else has to follow very regulated protocols as to when they are allowed to enter. So all of the animals that you can see kind of hanging there precariously are acting casual, but they're waiting very diligently for when their rank enables them to enter their sleeping site. I'm also interested in issues of animal rights, and I'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end, and issues of social justice. So once you come to campus in not too long, I encourage you to stop by my office. I'd love to see you if you have interest in any of these things. You might be able to meet my dog. She's often here. Unfortunately, she's not very friendly, but anyhow, you can meet her. Okay, so I'm going to start with a discussion of ethology. So this just means, ethology means the study of animal behavior. And so this is what I specialize in, is looking at the behavior of lemurs. And so what animal behaviorists do is that we observe animals in order to understand how and why they behave the ways that they do. And there's a couple of things that we're looking for. First is what we actually see, and this is called the proximate causation. So what we see is the proximate cause. It's the thing that's right in front of us. And the reason that we do this is we want to understand the ultimate causation, and that means why the behavior evolved, or why the animals are engaging in the behaviors they are. So this is just a framework for how anyone who studies animal behavior works. We look at what they do and we try to understand why they do that, or what environmental traits led to the selection of that behavior. And so I'm going to open my, let me see, chat window. Where is my chat? And I'm going to ask you in this slide, we've got an opossum here. So I want you to tell me, what is the proximate causation? So what are you seeing here? Okay, it's dead. He's playing dead. Yeah. So let's hope that he's not actually dead. I think he's playing dead. So that's the proximate cause. So when we look at this, if we saw this out in the wild, we would say, okay, yes, that opossum is playing dead. That's what we see. So thank you. Lots of people are still saying, yes, laying on its back as if it's dead. Absolutely. So now tell me, what is the ultimate causation of this behavior? Or why is this opossum playing dead? Yeah, absolutely. So we can infer that this opossum was likely scared by something. And the reason it's playing dead is that it is trying to fool a potential predator. So if what likely would have happened, or an example of what could have happened here, is that the opossum saw a big hawk or saw some kind of an animal that it thought could be detrimental. So it could threaten its life. And so it's playing dead in the hopes that the predator will think, oh, that animal must be sick or died and is potentially poisonous. I don't want to touch it. I should probably stay away. So proximate cause, we look at it, we see it, we think it's playing dead, or maybe it really is dead. And the ultimate causation is really it's for survival of the opossum. So it's protecting itself from being predated. Okay, so with that in mind, I'll switch to talking more about artificial intelligence and how this intersects with ethology. Okay, so this was one of the short popular articles that I asked you to read. It was, "Will artificial intelligence help us talk to animals?" And so if we think about this, if we think about what this article is, or what the title of this is actually saying, help us talk to animals, we kind of think of, or at least I think of, a couple of different things. I kind of feel like I'd love to be this little girl with the puppy there, and I imagine that they're actually having a conversation. It's not just that she's whispering something, it's that they're actually communicating something. Or we can think of something like Dr. Dolittle, where somebody has some kind of special powers and they can communicate with all kinds of animals, and those animals become more like their friends. There's less of an interspecies difference because everybody understands everybody and kind of gets along. So this is not what AI will enable us to do, is to have conversations with animals, although it is promising for helping us understand animal communication. So what we're going to do now is we're going to watch a short video on AI and bat communication so that you can get a better idea of what it actually means to be using AI and what kind of potential that the AI has for helping us understand how other species live. So I just have to open the, give me a second here. I think this is about 4 minutes long. So just so that you're ready. And so yes, I just want you to, as you're watching this, be thinking about how we can use AI to understand other species, particularly communication, and how that's a little bit different than what the title of that article said, is helping us talk to animals. Okay, so that helped us see a little bit more as to what we're talking about in using AI with animal communication. So it's funny because even in the video, they sort of frame it in this scientist that wants to have this Dr. Dolittle machine. And then close to the end, he says, yeah, well, I doubt that'll ever happen in my lifetime. So it's not actually that we're creating or that anyone is creating this machine where we can talk to other animals. Really, we're trying to understand other animals better. And we could use that in ways to talk to those animals, but not like having a conversation with them. So an example could be, say there's a roosting colony of bats that are at risk of extinction or endangered, and there is a building project coming. So a big highway is going to be put through where these bats live. We could potentially use AI and the understanding of bat communication to, say, move a colony. So to start, initiating vocalizations that suggest we should go over here, or in the new place, initiating vocalizations that are there's food here, or this is a good place, or other indications that suggest that the animals are happy there or settled there. So this could be a tool for communicating with the animals, but not something like we're going to sit around and have conversations with bats, very unfortunately. And so just a little bit more about interspecies communication and what I'm referring to as talking apes. So we have a long history, humans have a long history of trying to communicate with other animals, and apes are a good example, or a good species to potentially try to communicate with because they're our closest living relatives. So for example, it's easier for us to try to communicate with an ape who has similar physiology, similar morphology than it would be to communicate with a dolphin, because a dolphin has very different morphology and physiology than we do. And so early studies of this, which were slightly over 100 years ago in the early 1900s, what people did was brought apes into their homes, mostly in England, some in America as well, and wanted to essentially raise these young apes as if they were humans, thinking that the animals would be able to talk, that they would learn how to talk just like a human would. And you tell me by way of chat, was this successful, yes or no? What do you think happened? Were the apes able to talk? Nope, 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 nope. Okay, why? You have any idea of why the apes could not talk? Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Okay, so yeah, they don't have the same vocal cord structure, so they can't physically make the noises that we make. So that doesn't mean that they can't think about communicating or that they don't think about communication, but they just can't physically make those noises. And actually what happened with people that took these apes into their homes was that their human children started to communicate using ape vocalizations and ape gestures. So these people were really unhappy because instead of having apes that behaved like children, they had children that behaved much more like apes. So that didn't really work out very, very well for them. But then later in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, what scientists did was to use sign language to try and communicate with chimpanzees and other species, but mostly chimpanzees. So can you tell me, do you think that apes were able to learn and communicate with sign language? Yeah, great. Okay, lots of yeses. Absolutely. And they were. And there's a famous study that has been reported. This is the chimpanzee shown here. Her name was Washoe. She's passed away now, but she was used as one of the apes in one of these sign language studies. And what the research did was, when Washoe came into the home, it was sort of like it was a home setting, but it was graduate students and the researchers that lived with the apes. So, and they sort of did shifts. So it was sort of like a home, but not exactly like a human home. And they only used sign language. They never spoke in front of these chimpanzees. So they communicated themselves with sign language, and they communicated and taught the apes how to use sign language. And then what the big sort of twist in this experiment was that Washoe here, when she, this is her adopted son, when she got settled with the baby, what happened was the researchers completely stopped signing. They never signed in front of her baby, and they only spoke. So she went from only ever seeing people sign to then having them only speak. And what happened is that she taught her baby how to sign, how to communicate with sign language. So this is how we knew that she fully understood how to sign, because he was then able to sign and communicate with the humans via his signs. But the thing here too is that when we think about this, I think we imagine having sort of meaningful, deep conversations about feelings and the future and things that humans find very important. Other species just don't have the same priorities that we do. So even though these different species of apes can communicate with one another in a language that we can understand, and they can communicate with us in sign language, it's a different kind of communication, and it's not necessarily what we think. So they say things about food, about things in front of them, but they don't say things like, what are your hopes and dreams? What do you want for your life? Where am I going to be in 5 years? So their scope of what they discuss in terms of communication is just really different, because our cognitive structures, although they are quite similar, there are differences. And so when we expect other animals to be able to think like we do, we're sometimes sort of sadly realize that this just isn't possible, because they're just not the same as us. We're expecting to be able to see ourselves when really each species is different and its own, just like we are different and our own. Okay, so yes, artificial intelligence is also being used to recognize behaviors in wild animals, which is really wonderful, because collecting data in person on wildlife is really challenging. And so this can be used with a lot of photos it's being used with. So here is a picture of some chimpanzees. These are in a open landscape or a semi-wild sort of habitat. But this is a Japanese study. And what they've trained their systems to do is to recognize individuals. So instead of having a person there that is looking and saying, oh, okay, which chimpanzee is that? Can I see this facial pattern? Who can I tell who is who? The system here is trained to recognize those individuals. And so it makes it much easier to decode or to understand the video footage than actually just being present and having to follow one animal at a time. And this has been used in a whole bunch of different species and comparing wild behaviors in different regions with chimpanzees. So this is good also in areas where maybe the animals aren't habituated to human presence, and it wouldn't be good for the animals for them to be habituated. So if they are very wild, they're not used to humans, and potentially there's hunting or there's some kind of human threat that you don't want them to be subjected to, then it's best not to actually go and get them used to having humans present. So even if we can't physically be there for the well-being of the animals, we can have cameras present and monitor the behavior, and then compare that to other locations. And one potential application for this that hasn't been done yet, but I hope to collaborate with someone in the future, and this is a lot to look at, but one of the things that I study is looking at both legal and illegal trade of lemurs in Madagascar. So all of these lemurs have been moved from wherever they were born, moved from a completely wild habitat to go to a resort or a location where people like to come to visit the animals. And so this is challenging because we don't really know, because it's pseudo-legal or not, it's because it's tolerated. We don't really know how many animals are taken from forests and moved to places like this. And we don't really know how many animals potentially die during that process. So one of the things that I would love to have done is a facial recognition software specific to lemurs, so that all of these pictures are from Instagram. So what I do is go on Instagram and look at these locations that I know there are lemurs present, and that there are frequently looks like new lemurs present, and take screenshots of these photos, seeing how people are interacting with them, what animals are present, when the animals seem to not be present anymore, and look at various factors like that in order to try to understand what's going on more. And I just want to point out that if you're ever in a situation where somebody suggests you share a piece of food with a wild animal, dear Jesus, do not do that. This is a really bad idea. Every time I see pictures like this, I'm just like, oh my God, like what kind of disease could come out of that? Who knows? You know, how big of a chunk of your face that animal could potentially remove? Who knows? Yeah, these are wild animals. They're not pets, and they're not, we shouldn't be sharing bananas with them. Okay, so I'm going to move to talking about Neuralink and Mind Pong. Okay, so before I'm going to show you this video, and it's kind of oxymoronic of me, I guess, to tell you first how unethical I think it is. But I'm just going to do that because I'll explain why. I don't consider experimenting on primates to be ethical. And the reason for this is that primates, they're our closest relatives. They're really similar to us in a lot of ways. And they're highly intelligent, and they're also social. Part of being a primate is being social. This is so important to our well-being that something like solitary confinement is really about the most cruel thing you can subject a human or a primate to, because it's completely against our nature, and we're unable to thrive in solitary confinement. So highly intelligent and highly social, and also able to suffer. So primates have a high ability to suffer. And for me, laboratory life, which often includes solitary isolation, just inflicts too much harm. So the balance, the costs and the benefits that are gained from having primates in experimental work, for me, is it's not sufficient. And also something that we know is that experiments on primates often can't be translated to humans. So sometimes they can. Vaccines for hepatitis were developed, successful vaccines for humans against hepatitis were developed on non-human primates. But also in the AIDS crisis in the mid to late 80s, when we were really trying to figure out what was going on with HIV and AIDS, millions and millions of dollars was spent on inflicting chimpanzees with HIV. And it turns out that chimpanzees don't actually get AIDS in the same way that we do. So in that example, it wasn't actually worth it in the end, and it was quite detrimental for all of the money that we spent and the time that was spent experimenting on those animals. Okay, so I don't think that this research is ethical, but I do think it's of use to have a look at it. So we're going to look at his name is Pager. So this monkey's name is Pager, and he's a 9-year-old macaque, and he is owned by a company called Neuralink, which creates chips that are to be placed inside of the brains of animals. And so this, I'm sure that this video doesn't have sound, that it's just, I'm pretty sure it's just, no. Bear with me just a sec. Okay, so I've got the transcripts on, and this is, let me see, 3.5 minutes. So we'll watch that, and then we'll reconvene after. Okay, so uh, I think we should give credit where credit is due, that this is pretty remarkable. That this, what they just demonstrated to us was that this monkey is actually controlling the video game with his mind, which is really remarkable. And what the reason that is given as to why this is important is because it's said that this could be used in order to help people who have had accidents and are unable to control parts of their body. And so this technology could be adapted for all different types of uses in humans. But I'll just note that this had actually been done in humans about 6 years before it was actually done on the monkeys. And so this wasn't something that was novel and created, that was really novel and created for a human application. They just kind of wanted to play around with this in other species. And they successfully did that, but I encourage you, if you're interested in the ethics of this, to just Google Neuralink and have a look at the record that they actually have with these animals. So I mean, the ability to do this already existed, but they, wanted to continue to experiment. Anyhow, I'm gonna end up here with conclusions. So AI is useful for a whole bunch of applications to do with animal behavior, the study of animal behavior. There's some limitations on how we can interact with other species because these are other species. We tend to forget that other species are quite different than us because we only know our own experience, but being able to communicate with other animals doesn't necessarily mean what we think it does. But AI does have some really promising and remarkable applications that could be used to improve both human and non-human animal well-being. But this needs to be built within an ethical framework. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and I'll pass the speaker off. I'll pass this off.
Awesome. That was an amazing talk. It made me think of that book, Congo, which was made into a movie, and then it was a pretty bad movie, but where the signs and then it has like a reader that talks for it. But that was super interesting. We're going to move right along here to Dr. Babka.
All right. So I'm Dr. Babka. I am in the Theology and Religious Studies Department here at the University of San Diego. Welcome to any of my new advisees who are out there in cyber world. I just wanted to introduce myself a little bit. My specialty is the relationship between art and religion, how they intersect. How do we use art in religion? How is art kind of a religious endeavor because it seeks something greater than ourselves in terms of expression? And so I became interested in artificial intelligence out of an interest to talk about what makes us human. And I think that art and religion are two of the things that make Homo sapiens, that make us truly human. And so the question of whether AI can do the sorts of things that human beings can do, or whether artificial intelligence is really and truly intelligent, has to do with what it means to think about human intelligence and what constitutes human intelligence, but also things like emotion and imagination and what it means to feel things. And so I am also the technology and humanities chair, even though I don't obviously know everything about technology. I am the technology and humanities chair of the Humanities Center here on campus. We have talks going on all the time, so you're always welcome to drop into one of our series. So the title of this talk is Can Qualia Be Quantified? And why I'm asking this question is because the driving force behind anything in a computer is an algorithm. Algorithms depend on computational data and numbers. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves when we're talking about artificial intelligence is, how much could it possibly inhabit the sort of intelligence that human beings have? So the first thing that we're going to talk about is just, what is conscious experience? What does it mean to think about something called consciousness. Qualia are related to what it means to talk about consciousness. So your conscious experience is all there is. And this is, of course, for you as an individual, that all you know about the world is in terms of how you experience it when you're conscious. Most of the time you are conscious. Even when you're asleep, when you're dreaming, you're conscious. Dreams are part of our conscious awareness, and so then part of our lives. The only time that we're not really dreaming is maybe if you're in a coma, or if you are under general anesthetic, that you probably won't be dreaming, because this is what we, refer to in terms of, non-conscious states. But most of the time you're awake and aware, or you're dreaming, and your conscious experience is how you access the world. Without your conscious experience, you have no world, you have no self, you have no interior and no exterior. Everything that is, everything in existence is perceived in some way by something. Dr. LaFleur was talking about bats and lemurs and all sorts of animals. All are conscious. They all have some way of experiencing the world around them, and that is how we talk about existence in terms of conscious experience. Everything that exists exists in terms of how it appears to our conscious. Things show themselves, things express themselves to our conscious life, but also to non-human animal life. Everything might even be conscious in terms of the plant world, in terms of viruses and all sorts of, organisms that we can't see. So there are phenomena, which are appearance of things, and there are receivers of phenomena, or conscious beings. This interaction makes up what is real. And the term for phenomena comes from the Greek word phenomenon, which means appearance. And so when things appear to us, that is their phenomenal, that's how they appear to us phenomenally. So Dr. LaFleur talked about bats, and this is a famous problem in consciousness studies in philosophy. Thomas Nagel wrote one of the more famous philosophical papers titled, "What's It Like to Be a Bat?" and to try to understand something about bat consciousness and why human beings will never fully understand what it means to be conscious as a bat is conscious. So we have no subjective grasp about how a bat senses the world. Bats use echolocation in order to try to find their way through the world and identify objects and phenomena around them. We have scientific information, as Dr. LaFleur was saying, about bats' brains. So we can do measurements and study them and study their behavior. The problem for our interests is that we can never fully understand what it is like to only be able to view the world or experience the world through echolocation. David Chalmers, the philosopher, calls the scientific data that we can gather from studying bat brains and bat behavior the easy problem of consciousness. And it's not easy because, as though science is easy. It's easy because we can set up an experiment. We can set up a methodology that tells us something about what we want to find out. We can set up a hypothesis. We can come to a conclusion based on the data that we collect. And so there's a way that we can go about it. There's a set of steps that we can use in order to find out what we want to know. But science cannot tell us what it is like to be a bat. And this Chalmers calls the heart problem of consciousness. The way bats and humans process sensory information is far too different for human beings to ever subjectively understand what it is like to be a bat. And we have no access to the way bats understand the world subjectively. We have no access to the way bats experience objects. We can assume certain things and make conclusions, but there is a hard problem here in terms of being able to accurately describe in a bat's world what bats experience. So I've been saying some things about consciousness. Consciousness originally used to refer only to awareness or knowledge, whether shared or private. Self-consciousness, you've probably heard of. This refers to an awareness of oneself as a subject. Class consciousness typically refers to an awareness of belonging to a particular economic group. But the term consciousness has evolved to refer to the inner experience of our own mental state, or the perceptions, feelings, sensations, and thoughts that make up the what it's like of being you. This inner experience that you have, and I have, and everyone has, is very difficult to describe to someone, even if we may share similar events. And this happens if you're in a family with multiple siblings. You may all be at the same event and experience it in vastly different ways. You have the same parents, you share DNA, you share an environment, but you can't fully understand how one of your siblings is experiencing the same family event. And that's just part of the problem of being a subject, is that we can never fully know what any one person goes through or experiences. So qualia are the qualities of experience. In the singular, we use the term quale. And so what this refers to is what a given experience is like from inside the subject. This is what we mean by conscious experience. Qualia and then conscious experience or phenomenal experience are multifaceted. There's all sorts of things that go into a particular experience. How you feel that day is probably colored by how much sleep you got and what kind of breakfast you had in the morning, and how something else is on your mind in terms of a relationship. So how you experience any one thing has all sorts of factors that are almost impossible to quantify. And it's also embodied experience. And this is something that I can't fully get into today, but embodied experience means having sensory perception and understanding my body in relationship to the world around me. So an experience can have a phenomenal character, it can have a qualitative feel, all based on trying to parse through this very complex thicket of qualifying factors. And because it's so complex, I argue, and several other theorists argue, that these sorts of things escape algorithmic programming, which is what drives artificial intelligence. If you can't formulate an algorithm to explain the experience of, for example, biting into an orange, you can't write software to duplicate that experience in a computer. So another thing to remember, an entity is conscious if it has experiential properties. The totality of the experiential properties of an entity are the what it's like to have consciousness and have an individualized or subjective consciousness that only you can experience in the world. So if the experience of biting an orange cannot be described to a person without the senses of taste and smell, how can a computer programmer expect to duplicate qualia experiences in a computer using a computer code? If the true experience can't be explained, and we can attempt to explain it, as fully as possible, but the totality of it probably will never be fully captured in an explanation of any kind. If the true experience can't be explained, it is non-algorithmic and therefore non-computable. This is all the argument of Robert J. Marx. There are devices called artificial noses, for example, artificial tongues that detect chemicals like the molecules associated with the orange. But these sensors experience no pleasure when the molecules are detected. They experience no qualia. Duplicating qualia, according to Marx, is beyond the capability of artificial intelligence. So in the next part of what we'll do today, I'm going to talk a little bit about art and ambiguity. Ambiguity is that quality of it could mean more than one thing at the same time. It could mean, it's again, art pieces are multifaceted. And so there's always going to be a multiplicity of explanations, a multiplicity of meanings when you're thinking about art. This photograph was taken by Julien Wasser. This is Marcel Duchamp, the famous artist, who is sitting in front of one of his most famous works of art, The Fountain, at the Pasadena Art Museum in 1963. And so you can see that his artwork, The Fountain, is here and here. And so this photograph was taken by Alfred Stieglitz, who was Georgia O'Keeffe's companion for a good portion of their lives. He was a famous photographer. She was the famous painter of skulls and objects in the desert. So he photographed this piece at the Society of Independent Artists. It was sent in by Duchamp because the jurors who were curating the exhibition said that they would accept anything, that they would accept absolutely everything. And so he sent this work in for the exhibition, and they promptly rejected it. They rejected it because it's a urinal. It's a urinal that's been turned upside down and put on a pedestal. Duchamp signed it R. Mutt. We're still trying to figure out why he did that. He signed the date 1917. And it's become one of the most famous works of art in history, in Western history. It's probably one of the most influential works of art in the 20th century. And you might say, why would a urinal on a pedestal be one of the most influential works of art of the 20th century? Because no one had done anything like this before. And after it, we can't even imagine where art went without this piece. This piece started a whole barrage of thinking about art in completely new ways than it had been thought previous to it. Art before this was thought of as something that was dealing with, what is real and how do we capture what is real, or how do we abstract from what is real. And what he does is he forces us to think about an object in our everyday lives. A urinal is something, men usually encounter most. And he turned it upside down in order to change the perspective, signed it with a different name than his own, and tried to get us to think about an object outside of its context. Thinking of this outside of the context creates all sorts of issues. It creates issues of sensuality. The porcelain is very smooth to the touch. The curves are sensuous. It's been thought of as a way to play with gender. It doesn't work anymore as a urinal for a male anatomy. Could it work for a female anatomy? Is it trying to play with different forms of function and usefulness? And we don't have to get into all of the reasons why this is an important work of art, except to say that what art does in terms of creativity is try to play with all of these ambiguous ideas. And so the kernel of creativity is in doing something that completely surprises us, that no one has ever thought of before. Putting things completely outside of their intended use, for example, that Duchamp did at first. And so I want you to look at this. This was something that my dyslexic younger brother did in Pictionary. And all of us who are hetero or who are, neurotypical, we looked at this and couldn't figure out what he was doing. He was drawing a door in Pictionary. The neurotypical person might have drawn a rectangle with a small circle, and he didn't do that. He drew a door from the edge of a door. And that, to me, astounded me. I was completely blown away by this. And I think that this is why people who think or learn differently than the neurotypical one like me does, is they have astounding ways of looking at the world that no person could possibly replicate. It's something that he came up with. And so his dyslexia opened a way toward a creative impulse to see the world in a completely new and surprising way. And so thinking about creativity, thinking about how we experience the world as only you or I experience it, means searching for something that surprises us. So I wanted to show you a little bit about art in Florence. Some of you may want to come to Florence during your second year experience in the intercession next year when you're sophomores. This is the artist Donatello's version of David. Now, David in Florence, Italy, is the sort of patron saint of the city. And this is because David in the Bible has this famous story of slaying Goliath, the giant that is terrorizing the village and killing people and everything. And David is a young boy in the biblical story who takes his slingshot and knows that he has one shot that he's going to be able to make before the giant's going to kill him. So he better be accurate. In the Bible, of course, the story is that the young boy who seems powerless in front of the giant slays Goliath. Here you see Donatello has showed us David, young boy in very Italian or Roman dress, with the head of Goliath at his feet. And then this didn't quite satisfy Donatello. So a few years later, he does this. This is another way to look at the story. Here, David is using nudity. It's the first freestanding nude male sculpture since antiquity, since the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks used to use nudes all the time. So what he was doing was he was highlighting the vulnerability of David, taking his clothes off, taking his armor off, but he still has Goliath's head at his feet. So what he's showing you with the sword and not the slingshot is he's showing you that he has just cut Goliath's head off, but he killed him with the slingshot. So the most famous version of this, of course, is Michelangelo. This was done about 70 years or so after that previous piece by Donatello. And you might notice that there's no head of Goliath here. And what we have is a very different way to think about this story, or this way of looking at the story through art. And if you really look, you might notice that what he's doing is carrying his slingshot over his shoulder. So the pose is contrapposto, he's nude, he's vulnerable, but what we have is something completely different in terms of all of the history. And there were many sculptors who did David. I just showed you Donatello. What we have is the first time ever that an artist captures David before he takes the shot at Goliath. And that is what makes this statue so compelling. It's the ambiguity. We don't know if Goliath will be killed in terms of the way the tension that is being brought forth in this statue. We have the piercing stare of David, and he's thinking about his shot, and he has his slingshot, and he's thinking about how he's going to do this. But at this point in the artistic, our imagination, we don't know if he's going to kill Goliath. And that gives us that even further heightened sense of vulnerability, that further heightened sense of tension, and shows Michelangelo's creative genius. Paul Tillich was a theologian who said, facing the God, who is really God, means also facing the total threat of non-being. And so this is what it means to think existentially. We have to constantly face the threat of our non-being as human beings. This is the most basic anxiety, the anxiety of a finite being over the threat of non-being. And it can't be eliminated from human life. It can't be eliminated from human experience. One of the reasons why being on a roller coaster or bungee jumping or doing anything that's got a little edge of danger to it gives us a thrill is because we're so close to the possibility of our own death. This anxiety, Tillich says, belongs to existence itself. So science, computation, algorithms cannot explain or describe qualia in their totality. One has to experience an orange to grasp the meaning of eating that orange. And they can only grasp that meaning fully for themselves in their own subjective experience. So that's why even when we experience something, it's strictly about the subject and can't be universal. Now, this isn't to say that we can't share our experiences and understand more fully what reality is when we share our experiences. The issue I'm trying to deal with in just this one little talk is whether we can ever fully know what another person experiences when it's experience that's different from our own. The same is true for romantic love or the discovery of something you're passionate about, such as surfing or playing the guitar. These are multifaceted sensory experiences that defy and may always defy any easy or data-driven explanation or description. So one of the things that I want to draw us back to in terms of the meaning of being human is that intuition, creativity, understanding, all infuse the nature of art as an attempt to express the uniqueness of how one experiences the world. All are impossible to put into terms that AI can truly replicate or produce. In order to have qualia, a computer would have to be embodied, feel pleasure and pain, and have all the sensory capabilities that any animal has, as well as be vulnerable and mortal. So all the things that make life worth living, dogs, chocolate, climbing mountains, falling in love, are multisensory and complex and that defy logical and objective description. Recognizing subtleties of meaning, the shared language of humor between friends or in a culture, the acknowledgement of ambiguity, the beauty of metaphor and poetry, the thrill of looking up 1,000 feet of the ceiling of a cathedral are all part of the wonder that is human life. Something that AI can regurgitate, it can mimic, it can simulate, but not experience. AI cannot know what it is to question, why am I here, for itself. So to live as a human is to be a question to oneself, to wonder what my limits are, to grapple with the ultimate limit of my own death. I just wanted to show you too some of the earliest representations of art by the species Homo sapiens, which we still are in. And so this is the lion human. It was carved out of mammoth ivory using a flintstone knife. We estimate that it took 400 hours to produce. Scientists have taken a similar piece of ivory and tried to carve it with a knife to see how long it actually took. This is the oldest known evidence of religious belief in the world. It is 40,000 years old. And it's the oldest known evidence of religious belief, not because there's organized religion 40,000 years ago. Obviously, there's no Christianity, no Islam, no Hinduism. it's about that religious impulse that requires the imagination to imagine something that doesn't exist, something that is not right phenomenally in front of us. And that's what this does. It imagines something that no one had imagined before. The artist carved this out. A human body with a lion's head. And then because of the way it was handled and the way it was used, we have to assume that it was used in some sort of ritual. And those rituals and those experiences of this piece were so important to the culture that produced it that they were willing to take 400 hours out of survival, out of hunting for food, out of seeking shelter, out of mating, in order to produce this. And that, to me, is the crux of what makes us human, is that we are willing to spend huge amounts of time doing something that does not ensure our survival. The Lascaux caves in France, there's obviously cave art all over the world. This is one of the most famous examples of cave art. The picture gallery is 100 feet by 35 feet, which means that if you think about the typical person who lived at this time, about 30,000 years ago, they were probably my height, about 5 feet tall, and at their tallest, and would have only been able to paint at eye level without the use of scaffolding. What they did in this instance is create a scaffold in order to climb higher and higher and higher in the cave. Some of the paintings are 14 feet off the ground. And think about it. So the scaffolding would have been on a very slippery rock floor. I'm sure that there were many who fell off of a high scaffolding, probably cracked their head open. So they risked their lives to make these paintings. And they did not do this for habitation. There is no evidence that these caves were used for habitation. No evidence they lived there. These aren't decorations for your living room. What they were is probably something used in a ritual that it was similar to the Lion Man, that they were used in some sort of religious or similar spiritual type of event. And they refer to animals. They refer to what it feels like to encounter animals in the dark. Remember, in a cave like this, some of the areas are a mile deep. There is there's no source of natural light. So they would have had to also invent a small lamp. And there's been evidence that they've found little oil lamps that they've used to bring this flickering flame into this deep, dark cave in order to do this. So that's why we have to ask the question, why do this? Why go to these lengths? Why create something that risks your life, that does not ensure your survival, that's not about decorating where you live, your dorm room, your habitation? Why do this? And so we don't know the answer to that. This is part of that ambiguity that drives human life. And we can call it religious because it refers to something that is greater or beyond ourselves. It doesn't refer to a specific religion. It's religious because of the impulse to do something greater than ourselves. And there is not a single human culture globally that doesn't have some sort of a transcendent or religious dimension and some sort of artistic dimension that accompanies it. So religion and art are inseparable from the very beginning of human life, of Homo sapiens life. Like art, religion is an attempt to construct meaning in the face of the relentless pain and injustice of life. And this is something that I doubt, I'm not willing to completely close the door because I don't want to do that, but I doubt that artificial intelligence can ever fully capture what this is, can ever fully capture the experience of feeling that anxiety about non-being, that anxiety about things greater than ourselves, that threat of mortality. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so wonderful to go from the animal experience to the human experience. And I don't know about all of you, but it reminded me of some of the talks from last week when we were talking about AI generated art, replacing humans and how that turns out sometimes. We're going to move along for the sake of time. Our next speaker is Dr. Getz.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about language and how that might differ between humans' use of language and how machines or artificial intelligence has come to use language. And I am a cognitive psychologist. I study language and music perception. So psychologists seek to understand behavior at different levels of analysis, from individual neurons to complex interactions between people and different and the environment. And I do this using an empirical approach. So designing experiments in the lab or the field to manipulate different variables of interest and seeing how they affect behavior. And in my lab, which is called the LAMP lab for language and music perception, we do this either by having people complete tasks on a computer while listening to sounds, or we actually record their brain waves while they're completing the task using EEG in order to more directly measure how your brain is responding to different sounds. And in general, cognitive psychologists are interested in the scientific study of knowledge. And this includes how we acquire knowledge, gathering information from our senses and choosing which inputs to pay attention to, how we retain knowledge through different short and long-term memory systems, and how we use this knowledge for problem-solving, decision-making, language, and reasoning. So obviously this idea of understanding knowledge is not unique to psychologists or cognitive psychologists. So there's a growing field of cognitive science that looks at knowledge from different perspectives, including psychology and neuroscience, but also philosophy, linguistics, anthropology, and computer science, all aiming to sort of study how humans, non-human animals, and computers can perceive, learn, remember, and act. And just a quick plug that we have a new cognitive science minor starting at USD this fall, and I'd love to tell you more about it either during discussion sections later today, or you can email me if you're interested. So today I want to focus on speech and language, and I'm going to discuss some differences in how speech and language are acquired in humans and machines and what this might mean for the terms of artificial intelligence. So this is a very complex topic. I can teach whole courses on this topic. So today I just want to give you a few examples. So there's hierarchical comprehension from single sounds that we call phonemes, and you combine those into morphemes and words, and then to phrases, and then to sentences. In addition to all of that complexity, there's also how this maps onto the auditory waveforms for production and breaks the signal that we receive. And that signal might not actually line up to the breaks between words. So our brain is actually constantly deciding where one word ends and another word begins based on our prior experience. So I just chose two brief topics by way of introduction to this idea of language complexity. I'm going to give an example of phonology and morphology, and then syntax and semantics. And I'll define these terms before presenting an example of how humans and machines understand language in this way. And as I'm doing this, I want you to think about the question of, are language and knowledge actually the same thing, or how are they different from each other? All right, so in terms of morphology and phonology, phonology is when we're talking about the sound patterns. So when you're deciding how things rhyme with each other, or how words sound similar to each other, or segmenting different syllables together. Whereas morphology is a study of word structures. So you can have a base word like play, and then you can add different parts to it like player to make it a person who plays, or make an S on the end to make it plural. And I'm going to tell you about an experimental example of learning word boundaries in humans, and then how a computer model has learned morphology rules. So in humans, we learn to track the regularities in phoneme ordering and learn the rules of largely unconsciously and without explicit feedback or instructions. So for example, if you have heard enough examples of words in English, you would know that the sound ing usually occurs at the end of a word in English, but there are not really any examples where that is the beginning of a word. And so you can use that to determine where one word ends and the next word starts. And infants are actually very good at using these transitional probabilities to learn word boundaries. And by transitional probabilities, I mean within a word, that probability is high. So if I have the phrase pretty baby, the syllables prit and t are very highly likely to be correlated with each other. But then between t, the end of the word pretty, and bay at the beginning of baby has a lower transitional probability because you could say many things after the word pretty. It could be a pretty baby. It could be a pretty person. It could be a pretty car. It could be it could be pretty hard, right? So there are a lot of words that could follow that, and you can use the likelihood of syllables following each other to learn what counts as a word in your language. So in this particular study, they wanted to show that infants can use these transitional probabilities even for a made-up language by familiarizing them with what counts as a word in the language of continuous speech. So I'm going to just play this for a few seconds for you so you can hear what it sounds like. So note that we're not telling the infants anything before they listen to this. We're just playing this for them and seeing if they can figure out what counts as a word in this language. So I'm going to ask you, as you're listening to this, if you can type in the chat, if you can hear any words. So these are not English words, they're made up words, but what do you think counts as a word in this language?
Bi go ku bu la do ta du ba da ti ba bu la do ta du ba bi go ku da ti ba bi go ku ta du ba da ti ba bu la do bi go ku ta du ba bi go ku bu la do bi go ku
Anyone want to take
da
a
ti
guess
ba
of
ta
what counts
du
as
ba
as a
bu la
word?
do da ti ba bu la do ta du ba bi go ku bu la do da ti ba bu la do ta du ba da ti ba bi go ku bu la do da ti ba ta du ba bi go ku ta du ba da ti ba ta du ba bi go ku da ti ba ta du ba da ti ba bu la do bi go ku
Okay.
da.
Okay. Yeah, so some of you got some of the ideas, right? So you're basically taking which syllables are likely to follow each other, and those is what's going to count as a word in this made up language. So in this example, there were actually only 4 different 3-syllable words that made up this bulado, bigoku, dati ba, and tadu pa. So within those syllables, every time you heard the syllable bu, la, and then do followed it. But after the syllable do, it could either go to bi, to da, or to ta. So if you're learning the transitional probabilities, you'd learn that these syllables are more likely to follow each other than the ones across the words. Right, so we can't ask infants what I just asked you to ask them what counts as a word, right? Give an example of a word because they don't have speech to be able to do that. So what they did on being test, they tested them on, they played examples of full words like bulado or dati ba, or they played part words which go across the boundaries of the different words. And they measure how long the infants are willing to look at a speaker that's playing either these words or the part words, right? And so this is often used in infants as a way to measure your ability to distinguish between the words and the part words. And you would predict that they are more interested in something that's novel, meaning that if they have now been habituated to these words for 2 minutes, they're tired of listening to those words, and they would listen to a speaker that has these part words instead because they sound new and interesting. right? But if they can distinguish between these two different types of words by how long they're willing to look at it, it gives us some measure that they can actually distinguish between these words and non-words. And this is exactly what they found. So the infants looked significantly longer at the part words compared to the words, showing that, implying that they sound new and interesting and that they've learned what counts as a word in this made up language. And importantly, you'll see that I changed this to unsupervised statistical learning because the infants are using these transitional probabilities between the phonemes without any explicit initial states or rules or any explicit feedback. All right, so we're not telling them whether they are correct or not. We're not telling them that there are 4 words and that each one is 3 syllables. They're just figuring it out on their own. And they do it with only 2 minutes of passive exposure. And so this is something that we're interested in. Can AI learn to do this without any supervision? Can it figure out what counts as a word in a language? So this example of the MIT news reading that I had you do is about a press release from a 2022 Nature Communication study about a Bayesian program learning word form changes. So this is slightly different. It's using morphology rather than phonology because we're wondering whether we can build a computer model that can learn how words change for different functions across different languages. So they used linguistics textbook examples, and each had a set of words and then corresponding word form changes. So for example, in English, if you add an S to something, it often makes it plural. Or an example that they use in the paper is in Serbo-Croatian. If you add an A to the end of something, it makes a masculine form, now feminine. Right? And they thought that linguistics have thought that in order to really understand the rules of a human language, to empathize with what it is that makes the system tick, you have to be human. We wanted to see if we can emulate the kinds of knowledge and reasoning that humans bring to the task. So like I said, they had different textbook examples, and they trained this computer model to see whether it could accurately predict what the correct ending of a word should be in different situations, like if it's plural, or if it's past tense, or if it's masculine versus feminine form. All right, and so this is from the paper. Don't worry too much about the different colors, just look at the dark blue one on the top. So this was the model that they used, and it was able to come up with the correct set of rules to describe these word form changes across the different languages that they tested 60% of the time. And this led them to conclude that this work shows that we have some methods that can, to some extent, learn these types of inductive biases. But they also say that I don't think we've quite figured it out yet. Even for these textbook problems, the inductive bias that lets a linguist accept the plausible grammars and reject the ridiculous ones, right? So I just want to do a brief comparison here of phonology and morphology in humans versus the machines. So in humans, we learn these types of rules. We obviously make mistakes over time, but by the time we get to adults, we're pretty good at these types of rules. And this machine was able to train to do this about 60% of the time. In humans, we don't give any initial states. You don't have to tell them what counts as a word or not a word, or how many words or how many examples. Whereas this computer was programmed with all types of higher level knowledge. So it knew the number of phonemes that existed. It knew the program space. It knew the feature space. So it had to be engineered to have this type of prior knowledge to be able to get to 60% accuracy. In humans, again, we didn't give it any explicit feedback, but in this algorithm, they say that they used a solver-aided synthesis algorithm, which is engineered to start with a small program and then repeatedly use it over and over again, making modifications to try and explain more of the data. Right. So on these first 3, it seems like humans are doing better than machines. Something that I thought was interesting was that the synthesis across languages is actually better for the machines than it was for humans. So humans have a much harder time to learn different languages after a certain age. It's much harder to learn and sound like a native speaker after about age 8 or 10. Whereas they said that one of the things that was most surprising is that it could learn across languages. It didn't seem to make a huge difference. So the machine was actually better at synthesizing across the different languages how these rules work across languages than humans might be. Right? So overall, it seems that the machines are approximating some of this type of morphology knowledge, but it's clear that the mechanisms and the methods for doing so are probably learned very differently. Okay, so that is one example for phonology and morphology, differences between humans and machines. So I want you to keep thinking about the answer to this question of knowledge and language. And I want to briefly discuss another example of syntax and semantics. So syntax is the structured use and patterning of sounds into words and words into sentences. So it's the grammar rules of a language. And there are a specific set of rules of what counts as a grammatical sentence in one language versus the other. Whereas semantics is the literal meaning of the words. So the basic units are standing for something other than themselves, right? So a phoneme like the word cab has meaning, not because of the word that it creates, not just the sounds k, a, b, right? So it's the word and what it refers to, and that's what semantics is. It's the meaning of the words. Right, so in humans, syntax and semantics are generative and dynamic. So by generative, I mean that most of the sentences that you hear are words that are put together in a different order than you've ever heard before. But it uses words that you know, and if it follows the words of grammar to put them together, then you can understand them. And by dynamic, I mean that individual meanings in words always change over time. So for example, selfie is used to describe taking a photo of yourself, and that exists now because of the changing technology, and it didn't exist previously. Right. So this huge and dynamic generative lexicon, your mental vocabulary, the mental list of words that you know, means that ambiguity often exists. So for example, this headline, "Hospitals are sued by 7-foot doctors," could mean either that the hospital was sued by doctors who are 7 feet tall, or it could be that they are sued by 7 doctors, and the type of doctors they are foot doctors. Right, so luckily we have other cues that can help us disambiguate the surface level meaning. So for example, prosody is the rhythm and the pitch of how I actually speak. So if I say the hospital is sued by 7-foot doctors as opposed to 7-foot doctors, that can put emphasis on a different part of the meaning. And then there's also pragmatics, which is meaning in context. So these are like things that you expect other people to know. So it is very unlikely that there were multiple doctors who are 7 feet tall, because we know from prior experience that 7 feet is very tall for a human. Right, so meaning and pragmatics implies that prior knowledge and reinforces the complexity, right? So you can see all of these different levels of understanding language here, and all of these cues work together from the individual sounds to words to sentences to meaning in different contexts. And humans learn some formal rules from many of these different levels, but there's also a lot that we learn implicitly through exposure. And our prior knowledge shapes our understanding, and the language we speak influences our knowledge and our understanding of the world. So there's lots of really cool interactions between and across these different levels of analysis in humans. So how does this work for machines? So a thing that you've probably heard a lot about is ChatGPT. This is ChatGPT is a generative pre-trained transformer. And basically what that means is that you have to program it in with all of the text beforehand, and then it can be really good at making predictions based on that data set about when you give it a starting point, it uses this knowledge that it has in the system to generate text based on things that tend to go together. Right, so as Dr. Blazer talked about in week 2, these types of systems are really great at prediction, but that only implies one type of intelligence, right? So a few other key things about ChatGPT that are important to think about how it compares to humans. So it has to be trained by humans, right? So it's pre-trained by humans. So that means there's some sort of bias into which material it's trained on and what material it tends to think go together or are predicted to go together. It also can only make predictions based on what it's trained on. So it's not dynamic. It's not going to know new words that have just cropped up. Because, for example, ChatGPT 3.5, if you ask it about a current event from 2023, it cannot answer because it only knows things up to 2021. Right. And also sometimes when it answers, it does so confidently, but it's completely making things up. And these are called hallucinations. I've had this happen when asking ChatGPT for a good article or reference for a certain topic. It sometimes just makes up things by authors that do not actually exist, because again, what it's doing is it's just making predictions based on what words are likely to go together. It doesn't actually have knowledge in the system. Right. So as you can see, this seems pretty different from how humans are learning words and meanings and grammar. There's not actually knowledge of what it's saying. It's just really good at predicting words that belong together. Right, so again, thinking about how this compares across based on the Chomsky New York Times opinion piece that I asked you to read. So first, inputs in humans, Chomsky argues that this develops unconsciously, automatically, and speedily from minuscule data, whereas in the machines, we have to have very large training sets in order for it to be able to make these types of predictions. Right, both of them are actually very good at prediction. Chomsky argues that this is more superficial in machines because it's just putting words together and doesn't actually know why it's putting them together. And this relates to the outputs as well. So I talked about it being generative outputs. We can say all sorts of things in ways we've never said them before in humans. Whereas in the first week, Dr. Morgan talked about the types of outputs of ChatGPT being basic or blah, right? It's like a C-level paper. It's not doing anything super sophisticated. Again, we don't have to give humans explicit feedback, but Dr. Wenzel talked about that in the first week also, that we have human provided correction. And so you have to have humans in order to give the system feedback. So another difference is that humans are able to create explanations, right? It's in the paper, he argues that the human mind is surprisingly efficient and an even elegant system that operates with small amounts of information. It seeks not to infer brute correlations among data points, but to create explanations. Whereas the ChatGPT is incapable of distinguishing the possible from the impossible. So he says that whereas humans are limited in the kinds of explanations that we rationally conjecture, machine learning systems can both learn that the Earth is flat and the Earth is round. They trade merely in probabilities that change over time. All right, so this gets us to the overall assessment. And the words that I'm going to use here is actually something that Dr. Morgan mentioned during week 1. And I really liked the comparison that she made. So I'm going to bring it up again. So Chomsky argues that true intelligence is demonstrated by the ability to think and express improbable but insightful things. True intelligence is also capable of moral thinking, which is something that Dr. Vickers is going to talk about more in a few minutes, whereas machines are mostly just doing applied statistics. Right, so it's summarizing standard arguments in the literature by a type of autocomplete. It's not really taking a stand on anything. It pleads ignorance of lack of intelligence. It says it's fault, right? If you ask ChatGPT why it's doing something, it will tell you that it's following orders or that it's doing what the system was created for it to do. It's not actually having this type of agency or purpose in itself. All right, and so again, to summarize, even though machines can follow syntax rules and they can learn semantics meanings for individual words and ideas, it seems to be lacking actual intelligence or knowledge about how or why it's giving you the outputs that it does. All right, so I'm going to put some of these questions up here. These are not things that we're going to answer right now, but they're things that I want you to think about. We can talk about them in the discussion sections later. You'll also be asked to think about some of these things in your article what you're writing for this week. But ultimately, I want you to think about how these types of things and these differences might matter and what that means for what it means to be human. And so again, I'll end with just a plug. If you find this interesting, you can check out my lab, the LAMP lab, and also definitely check out the new cognitive science minor, and send me an email if you're interested in learning more.
Awesome. Yeah, you guys, if you get the chance, definitely take a class with Dr. Getz. We're actually teaching a class next spring together about language and how that's processed and acquired. So this also ties into a lot of talks we've had previously. So you can think about, the themes of agency and the way that AI kind of regurgitates information. We're going to move right along because we only have about 20 minutes left for Dr. Vickers and her talk.
Hey everyone. So I'm going to try to rush through this. It's a little bit complicated, so hopefully you can just bring questions to discussion, or you're welcome to send me an email or come find me, and we can chat about it. So let me see if I can share this screen. Okay, can everyone see my screen? All right, awesome. So I'm going to talk about Plato's perspective on what it means to be human, and the implications of this idea for artificial intelligence. So briefly about me, my name is Darby Vickers. I have my email address up there. My research interests are in ancient philosophy, ethics, epistemology, philosophy of education, ethics of technology. I teach classes in all of these things. So if you're interested in any of these topics, including ChatGPT, I teach classes on this kind of stuff. So feel free to join me for any of those to fulfill your philosophy requirements. So I want to get started and think about what it means to be human, especially in the face of changing technology. This will sort of bring a lot of the talks that you've heard today and throughout this course together. So the purpose of my particular contribution today is going to be threefold. The first part of it has to do with the content of what I'm talking to you about and the content of the reading that you did. So I want to look at Plato's definition of what it means to be human, which is a being with a tripartite soul, and sort of more fine-grained looked at what that means. I want to look at his definition of justice and how that sort of supervenes on what he thinks it means to be human. And then I also want to look at what makes humans unique. So justice is going to be something that is unique to humans, but also intellectual pleasure. And I want to tie that back into thinking about some of the stuff from Dr. Babka's talk and various other sort of themes that you've heard so far. The second thing that I want to do is I want to model how to extract theory or arguments from a non-straightforward text. So if you noticed, I gave you two different things to read that were sort of put together in a PDF. One was a sort of distillation of what was going on in Plato, because there was too much reading for me to give you exact sections. And then I gave you a small section of actual Platonic text, which you will notice was written in dialogue format. And has a sort of non-direct way of describing what's going on. And so I want to show you that close reading is a skill that can be useful across disciplines and will serve you in all of your classes, and is something that is still sort of beyond the power of even those sort of artificial intelligences that are being able to extract text from things like scientific articles today. And then the final thing that I want to do is demonstration, and particularly to demonstrate that old philosophical texts can provide insights for answering today's burning questions. There is a reason that you are here for a liberal arts education, which is to engage with some of this sort of human-produced material, both from the history of science, from art, from all of these other things. And I want to show you how this can answer questions that we have that seem new, but still gain insights from this kind of material. So let's start off with the tripartite soul. So you've read all about this, and this is mostly me trying to sort of filter that information to make sure that you got the essential points. So humans are distinguished from other creatures, according to Plato, by having a three-part soul. And each part of the soul houses distinctive desires that have to do with the sort of purview of that particular part and the tasks that it will have. The three-part soul looks like this. There's the reasoning portion, which is concerned with the intellect and mathematics and judgment and decisions. There's the spirited portion, which is the seat of the emotions. So it includes all the sorts of things that we might have in terms of anger and fear and all that kind of stuff is all part of the spirited part of the soul. And then the final part is appetite, which is important for us to keep ourselves alive, right? We are embodied beings, and if we do not eat, then we die. So there's an essential portion of the soul that's sort of responsible for doing those things and making sure we procreate and whatever. So for Plato, different animals have different parts. So we might think that an animal like a sea star or an insect might purely have appetite. It has certain instincts that allow it to keep itself and its hive alive. Then we have animals that have spirit and appetite, like cats and dogs and presumably lemurs, and things like that, which have emotions and a sort of more complex understanding of the world and ability to sense things around and make decisions based on that. And for Plato, we also have humans, which have this reasoning portion. It is not entirely impossible that there are non-human animals that have a reasoning portion in the way that Plato would think, and we just can't communicate with them, sort of thinking about to Dr. Lafleur's lecture. But so far, we don't know of any. But this is sort of what humanity looks like for Plato and his theory. So each part of the soul has a sort of characteristic part of or set of desires that goes with it. So reason has our intellectual desires, spirit involves our emotional desires, and appetite involves our bodily desires. And those desires are going to be really important for how we sort of shape our lives going forward. And fulfilling these desires yields pleasure, right? When I solve a complicated crossword question or I finish the New York Times crossword, I have a sort of pleasure that comes from that intellectual experience. Similarly, if I'm really angry at somebody and I yell at them, I might get a certain pleasure from that experience. So each part of the soul has a characteristic pleasure when its desires are fulfilled. And that characteristic pleasure is going to do some really interesting things. So the question might be, we know what emotional pleasure looks like. We experience that all the time. And we know what bodily pleasure looks like. So what is it that intellectual pleasure is? Well, if you think about it this way, the sort of appetitive pleasure could be something like eating a piece of chocolate cake. I love chocolate cake personally. That's why I usually use this as an example. And you get the sort of taste sensations and all of these wonderful things, and you're slaking your hunger and whatever. Then you might think of the sort of emotional pleasure that you get from winning a video game, or sort of defeating something, and that pleasure of victory and or of beating somebody else or whatever is a type of emotional pleasure. And then an intellectual pleasure might be the satisfaction that you get from solving a complicated math problem, or beating spelling bee and getting queen bee for the day, or whatever the case may be. And there's something sort of important about how we preferentially choose to fulfill some of these desires and experience pleasure from it. So when we're satisfying the soul, desire satisfaction strengthens the part of the soul of the desire satisfied. And the reasoning part of the soul needs strength to rule the others. So the idea here is that we should strengthen our intellectual desires to strengthen the rational part of our soul. So to make sure that our rational part and our judgment is in charge of what we are doing and how we are acting. So we don't just sort of go off brute emotions or off our repetitive desires. We should preferentially try to strengthen the intellectual part of our soul by finding intellectual desires and then fulfilling those desires and gaining pleasure from them. And Plato is going to explain this in a section that you've read with the metaphor of irrigation of like a farm, or particularly he's thinking of things like vineyards, right? So if we look at this section of the Republic, Socrates says, well, could you find anything that is more intimately related to wisdom than truth? And Glaucon says, of course not. Socrates then replies, then it is possible for the same nature to be a philosopher, lover of wisdom, and a lover of falsehood. Glaucon says, certainly not. Socrates says, so right from childhood, a genuine lover of learning must strive above all for truth of every kind. Absolutely. But in addition, when somebody's appetites are strongly inclined in one direction, we surely know that they become more weakly inclined in the others, just like a stream that has been partially diverted into another channel. Of course. Then when a person's desires flow toward learning and everything of that sort, they will be concerned, I imagine, with the pleasures of the soul experiences just by itself, and will be indifferent to those that come through the body. And if indeed a person is not counterfeit, but rather a true philosopher, that's entirely inevitable. And then Socrates will conclude, a person like that will be temperate then, and in no way a lover of money. After all, money and the big expenditures that go along with it are sought for the sake of things other people may take seriously, but that he does not. So you can ignore some of the sort of gender and like old-fashioned implications that show up here. But the idea is really important, right? And particularly these two sections that I have highlighted in yellow. So Plato's theory of pleasure operates on this metaphor of a liquid. And the reason that he is thinking about it in terms of a liquid is that it seems to have similar properties to a liquid, right? A liquid can sort of run into things, fill things up, but also leak out of vessels. And so he has this very famous metaphor in another dialogue called the Gorgias of somebody who is a pleasure-seeking person such that their soul is like a leaky jar. And the more pleasure you pour into it, the more pours out the bottom, and you have to continuously refill it with new pleasures over and over again, right? So there's this idea of somebody sort of constantly seeking for something new and novel. And we get something similar to this in a section you wrote at the Republic. And then more importantly here, there's this sort of idea of the stream, right? Where pleasure is going to be the thing that allows you to grow certain parts of your soul in a particular way that will then allow you to act well in the world and to make good decisions. So the stream in this portion is that it nourishes parts of the soul based on those desires that are satisfied. And the more desire satisfaction, the stronger the soul part is going to be. So a couple of things should be clear from this. And it's just, as you can see, right, it's this tiny, tiny little passage that's telling you this information, but you can extract all this material from what's going on. So it's not just that there are pleasures to the appetitive part of the soul, which is bodily pleasure, but rather there are pleasures characteristic of each of these parts. And by structuring our lives in a way that we fulfill specific types of pleasures, we change who we are as people. And this is something that seems to be really important to Plato in terms of the way that we can shape our lives and then live sort of thriving and fulfilling lives as humans. So for him, intellectual pleasure is something that is unique to humans because we're the only beings that have a reasoning part of our soul that also have a body that can be something that will allow for pleasure. If you're interested in what goes on, if you don't have a body and you have a reasoning part of your soul, I'm happy to talk to you about that separately, and I'll mention it a little bit later. So the idea is that intellectual pleasure is the pleasure of the soul itself in itself. And this is sort of the ultimate pleasure of the human soul because it is something that is sort of differentiated from the body, but still allows for pleasure to exist and allows us to sort of strengthen ourselves as humans. I'm going to do a brief comparison to John Stuart Mill. If you haven't heard of him, don't worry about it. He is a philosopher that was writing in the 1800s. Who believed that the way that we should think about ethics was that we should create policies that will do the greatest good or create the greatest pleasure for the largest number of people to try to ensure that those policies are going to do good. But something that's really interesting about Mill that often gets overlooked in his theory of pleasure is that he thinks that pleasures can be qualitatively different as well as quantitatively different. And he thinks that qualitatively better pleasures, including things like intellectual pleasure, actually sort of translate into something being quantitatively better, which means that we can use his sort of calculus for thinking about how the world works with this sort of qualitative aspect built into it. So we can give sort of greater weight to some of these qualitatively better pleasures. Plato thinks something similar to this. He thinks in this last section of the text that I gave you, that qualitatively better pleasures are going to allow somebody to feel quantitatively better. And he illustrates this in this totally bizarre mathematical analogy that's right at the end of the section I had you read, by saying that a philosopher is 729 times happier than the tyrant, who is somebody that is a slave to his bodily pleasures, and is sort of constantly having to refill that jar. So this is something that's interesting, and this is both something that's true in terms of the sort of fulfillment of the person, but also structures the way in which they can act ethically in the world. So in that way, the type of pleasure that we are interested in experiencing has implications for our character. And I don't have much time to talk about these questions. If we were doing a class of mine, we would talk about this sort of now and then come back and chat about it as a group, but I want you to think about these things. So how does characteristic pleasure shape personality? What are the 3 types of people that were mentioned in the passage that I had you read about this? And what does this mean about their relationship with pleasure? And then what does this tell us about the relationship of their souls? And the sort of quick answer that I can give you is that the ruling part of the soul shapes personality and determines the appropriate function of an individual in Plato's sort of ideal society that he generates. And that's an interesting metaphor, and I'm happy to chat with you about that. And if you're really interested, you can take Philosophy 116 with me, and we will talk about this extensively. Basically, he has an idea that there are sort of philosopher kings that should rule, auxiliaries that should protect the city, and producers that should be producing the food and all of the things that people live by. These are sort of go along with the people whose souls are ruled by reason for the philosopher kings, spirit or emotions for the auxiliaries, because they need to protect the city and use their emotions to do so, and people who are interested in sort of bodily and aesthetic pleasures, which will be the producers. Now, the sort of idea behind all of this and why I've had to set all of this up is this has to do with Plato's definition of justice. So justice for Plato is each part of a tripartite system, whether that be a human or whether that be a city, doing its own tasks and not interfering with the tasks of the others. So what this looks like is for justice in the soul means that the rational part is in charge and the other parts fulfill their respective duties, right? We still need these other parts of the soul. We're not supposed to be purely rational automatons. The idea is that the spirited part is going to protect the soul from both internal and external threats. So when you see injustice being done, you are supposed to be angry and use that emotional energy to do something about it. The appetitive parts of the soul keep the body alive and functioning to make sure that you can do the things that you need to do. Similarly, for justice in the city, this means that the philosopher kings are in charge and other classes fulfill their respective duties. The auxiliaries protect the city from both internal and external threats. You can see this sort of direct parallel. And the producers keep the city functioning by providing the goods and things that it needs. So the question would be, how is this relevant to artificial intelligence? There are a lot of different ways, and I'm going to sum these up super fast because I am already over time, I think. But humans are the only beings that we know of that have tripartite souls. We might imagine that there are sentient aliens that have sort of similar souls that could be described this way, or potentially, as I said before, non-human animals. For reference, for those who are interested, gods and angels differ because they're purely rational. They do not have a body and they do not have a spirit or bodily pleasures, obviously, because they don't have a body. So they have a single part soul that has a rational part only. And this means that they don't experience any pleasure at all, even though they are sort of rationally perfect. And we might imagine that artificial general intelligence, if we were to be able to create it, a real artificial intelligence that could learn and understand things, would be a purely rational being like gods and angels under this sort of description, and would have a single part soul. We can conceive of an AI that has a multi-part soul, as I think Dr. Babka talked about, but few envision creating one. So what does this then mean for all of the stuff that we heard about with Plato? Well, first off, justice and intellectual pleasure are unique features of humanity that separate us from AI and AGI. And this means that while AI can do good deeds and do them for rational reasons, justice is going to be beyond it, right? Because justice requires not just rationality, but mercy, empathy, compassion, and these sorts of things, which come from the spirited part of our soul and not from our rational part. And similarly, for those of you interested in things like algorithmic fairness, it might be possible for algorithms to be fair, although there's bias and all sorts of problems with that. But algorithmic justice is impossible until we have something that has the ability for things like mercy, empathy, and compassion, which are part of the spirited heart of the soul. In addition, intellectual pleasure is something that is unique to humans. And the sort of experience of intellectual pleasure, which you supposedly will get in a liberal arts education, is the peak of our humanity, right? So all those things that Dr. Babka was talking about. And the liberal arts education is going to train you to be able to understand, appreciate, and gain pleasure from the products of human intellectual labor. So even if we were to give an AI a liberal arts education, which has been floated recently in a meeting that I was in, without the ability to experience pleasure in that intellectual material, it would lack an essential component of our humanity and not be able to understand the kind of education that you are able to get here as humans. Okay, so that was extremely fast, but hopefully you got a taste of some stuff and we can talk about it in discussion, or feel free to email me with any questions or set up a meeting. Thanks, everyone.